December 23rd, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Snow falls in thick curtains across the barracks compound, muffling the world beyond the barbed wire. Inside Barrack 17, 23 German prisoners of war sit in near silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. The wood stove in the corner crackles weakly, its warmth barely reaching the far bunks. Outside, the American guards stamp their boots against the cold. Their rifles slung casually over shoulders, smoking cigarettes that glow like fireflies in the gathering dusk. One prisoner, Oberfeldwebel Hans Metzger, of the 352nd Infantry Division, stares through the frosted window at the distant lights of the town beyond the forest. He thinks of home, of Christmas markets in Hamburg that no longer exist, of streets reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. He wonders if his family is still alive. He wonders if he will ever taste his mother's stolen again. The sound of American laughter drifts from the guard station, foreign and incomprehensible. It is the laughter of men who believe they are winning, men whose cities still stand, whose families still gather. For Metzger and the others, captivity was supposed to be the end of the story. It was supposed to be suffering, hunger, perhaps death. Instead, something entirely unexpected was about to unfold in this frozen corner of America. Something that would shake the foundations of everything they had been taught to believe by late 1944. The United States held over 370,000 German prisoners of war scattered across more than 500 camps from coast to coast. Wisconsin alone housed approximately 20,000 German PO in facilities ranging from large permanent installations like Camp McCoy to smaller branch camps attached to lumber mills, canneries, and farms. The Geneva Convention of 1929 mandated specific treatment standards for prisoners of war, requiring captors to house and feed POWs at standards equivalent to their own base troops, to pay them for labor, and to permit religious observance and recreational activities. The United States, unlike many warring nations, adhered to these conventions with remarkable consistency, not merely out of legal obligation, but from a strategic calculation. American military planners understood that proper treatment of German prisoners would encourage surrender, potentially shortening the war. Moreover, with millions of American men deployed overseas, prisoner labor became essential to maintaining agricultural and industrial production on the home front. What no military planner anticipated, however, was the degree to which ordinary American civilians would extend not just tolerance, but genuine hospitality to enemy soldiers living among them. This was especially true in the rural communities of the Midwest, where labor shortages were acute, where German surnames still hung on mailboxes from earlier waves of immigration, and where the practical demands of farm life often superseded abstract notions of enmity. The German soldiers who arrived at camps like McCoy came with expectations shaped by years of Nazi propaganda. Since 1933, the Hitler regime had constructed an elaborate mythology about the United States, portraying it as a decadent plutocracy controlled by Jewish financial interests, a mongrel nation without true culture, a place where gangsters ruled the streets and racial violence consumed the cities. German soldiers were told that if captured by the Americans, they would be worked to death, starved, or handed over to Soviet authorities for execution. Wehrmacht training manuals warned that American democracy was a facade, that behind the propaganda of freedom lay a brutal capitalist machine that crushed the weak and exploited the masses. Many German soldiers, particularly those from working-class backgrounds who had joined the Wehrmacht before the war, believed this narrative completely. They had been raised on tales of German victimhood after Versailles, of encirclement by hostile powers, of the necessity of Hitler's new order to protect European civilization. When they surrendered in North Africa, Sicily, or France, many expected the worst. Instead, they encountered something their ideology had no framework to explain: the journey to American soil itself began the process of cognitive dissonance. After initial capture and processing in Europe, German PO were transported across the Atlantic in Liberty ships and troop transports. often the same vessels that had carried American soldiers east. Unlike the sealed cattle cars that carried prisoners in Germany and the East, these ships, while hardly luxurious, provided adequate space, food, and medical care. Upon arrival in American ports, prisoners were transported by train to camps across the interior. Many recorded their astonishment at the first glimpses of America through the train windows. Feldwebel Otto Kruger, captured at Normandy and sent to a camp in Nebraska, later wrote in his memoir that he could not reconcile what he saw with what he had been told. The cities, far from being war-torn, blazed with electric lights. The farms appeared prosperous beyond imagination. The rail yards were crowded with freight cars and automobiles. Where were the starving masses? Where were the signs of a nation supposedly on the brink of collapse? These observations were recorded in hundreds of letters and diaries that German prisoners wrote, many of which were censored by camp authorities, but enough of which survived to provide a remarkable window into the transformation that was beginning. Camp McCoy, established in 1909 as a National Guard training facility, sprawled across 60,000 acres of pine forests and sandy soil in central Wisconsin. By 1944, it housed approximately 5,000 German posts in a compound separated from the main base by fences and guard towers. The prisoners lived in wooden barracks heated by coal stoves, slept on steel frame beds with mattresses and blankets, and received 3 meals daily that, by Army regulation, had to meet the same caloric standards as meals served to American troops. This fact alone stunned many German prisoners. At breakfast, they received eggs, bread, butter, jam, and coffee with real milk and sugar. At midday, they ate meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread. At dinner, the meal was similarly substantial. The daily calorie count exceeded 3,500, more than most German civilians were receiving in the bound cities of the Reich. Some prisoners initially refused to eat, suspecting the food was poison or that they were being fattened for some cruel purpose. It took several days for most to accept that this abundance was simply the normal standard of American provisioning. The psychological impact was profound. If America could feed its prisoners this well while fighting a global war on 2 fronts, what did that suggest about American productive capacity? What did it suggest about the lies they had been told? The camp routine was regulated but not oppressive. Prisoners rose at 6, attended roll call, ate breakfast, and then either reported to work details or engaged in camp activities. The Geneva Convention prohibited forcing prisoners to work in war industries, but agricultural labor, forestry, and food processing were permitted. Wisconsin's economy in the 1940s depended heavily on agriculture, dairy farming, and timber, all sectors desperate for workers. German prisoners were contracted out to local farms and businesses, transported each morning in trucks under minimal guard, and returned each evening. They earned 80 cents per day, paid in canteen coupons that could be exchanged for cigarettes, toiletries, candy, and other small luxuries. This was of bitter irony for many prisoners. They were earning more as captives in America than they had as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Some sent part of their earnings home through the International Red Cross, trying to help families enduring privation they themselves had escaped. The work itself was hard physical labor, harvesting crops, cutting timber, processing in canneries, but it was compensated labor under decent conditions. Many prisoners found the work preferable to the boredom of camp life. More importantly, the work brought them into direct contact with American civilians. And it was here, in the fields and barns of Wisconsin, that the most unexpected encounters began. The farmers who employed German prisoner labor, by necessity, pragmatic people, they needed workers to bring in the harvest, to milk the cows, to keep their operations running while their sons and hired hands fought overseas. Many of these farmers were themselves of German descent. Wisconsin had received waves of German immigration throughout the 19th century. And by 1940, more than a third of Wisconsin residents claimed German ancestry. Towns bore names like New Berlin, Rhinelander, and Germantown. Lutheran churches conducted services in German well into the 1930s. The war had complicated this heritage. creating pressure to demonstrate loyalty by suppressing German language and customs. But the cultural connection remained. When German prisoners arrived to work the farms, something unexpected happened. Farmers heard the prisoners speaking German and recognized words, sometimes phrases. Older farmers remembered parents and grandparents who had spoken the same dialect. This linguistic bridge, even fragmentary, created a basis for a communication that transcended the enemy designation. More practically, farmers recognized that well-treated workers were more productive workers. If you wanted a prisoner to work hard cutting tobacco or picking peas, you treated him decently. You gave him water on hot days. You allowed him to rest in the shade. And increasingly, as the autumn of 1944 turned to winter, you invited him into the house for a meal. The first dinner invitations were tentative, almost furtive. A farmer's wife, seeing the prisoners eating cold sandwiches in the barn, would send out a pot of hot soup. A family would invite a work crew to sit on the porch for coffee and cake. The prisoners, accustomed to viewing Americans as mortal enemies, were bewildered. Why would these people, whose sons and brothers were fighting against Germany, show them kindness? The initial answer many prisoners accepted was that these were Germans, ethnic cousins who sympathized with the old country. But this explanation eroded as invitations came from families with names like Johnson, O'Brien, and Kowalski. The kindness was not ethnic solidarity. It was something more fundamental, something embedded in American culture that the prisoners had no framework to understand. It was the belief, however imperfectly practiced, that even enemies were human beings deserving of basic decency. It was also undeniably loneliness and curiosity. Rural Wisconsin in wartime was a place where young men had vanished by the thousands. Families longed for news, for male voices at the table, for labor and conversation. The German prisoners, strange as it was, killed some of that absence dot by December 1944. Dinner invitations had become common enough that the camp commandant, Colonel Thomas F. McKee, felt compelled to issue guidelines. Officially, fraternization between prisoners and civilians was discouraged but not forbidden. Prisoners could not be left unsupervised, but if a guard accompanied them, and if the farmer accepted responsibility, a prisoner could be allowed to eat a meal with a civilian family. The guards themselves, often local Wisconsin boys drafted into the army but assigned to guard duty rather than combat, were generally relaxed about enforcement. Many guards were farm kids themselves who understood the rhythms of rural life and saw no harm in letting a prisoner warm himself by the stove or accept a plate of food. Some guards actively facilitated these encounters, believing that the kindness reflected well on America and might hasten the end of the war by demonstrating the futility of Nazi ideology. The prisoners, for their part, approached these invitations with a mixture of suspicion, gratitude, and profound confusion. They were violating the oath they had sworn to the Fuhrer by accepting hospitality from the enemy. And yet, the warmth of a family home, the smell of roasting meat, the sound of children laughing, the simple human connection of a shared meal was irresistible after years of war, deprivation, and indoctrination. Hans Metzger, the prisoner staring out the barrack window that December evening, was assigned to a work crew at the Hartmann farm, 8 miles south of Camp McCoy. Emil Hartmann was 62 years old, a third-generation Wisconsin farmer whose grandparents had immigrated from Bavaria in 1852. He ran a dairy operation with 150 head of cattle, supplemented by pigs, chickens, and 40 acres of corn. His 2 sons were overseas, one in the Pacific with the Marines, one in Europe with the 101st Airborne. His daughter had moved to Milwaukee to work in a defense plant. Emil and his wife Martha ran the farm with the help of an elderly hired man. And beginning in September 1944, a rotation of German POWs from Camp McCoy. Metzger had been part of the work crew for 3 months. He was 31 years old, a career soldier who had joined the Wehrmacht in 1935, serving in Poland, France, and finally Normandy, where he was captured on June 17, 1944, during the Allied breakout. He had been a loyal soldier, a believer in discipline and duty. Though never a member of the Nazi Party, he had seen terrible things, done things he tried not to remember, and had long since lost any illusions about German victory. Captivity, initially terrifying, had become a kind of refuge. At the Hartmann farm, he milked cows, repaired fences, and mucked out barns. The work was monotonous but peaceful. Emil Hartmann spoke to him in broken German, a language he had learned as a child, but rarely used. Martha Hartmann, a quiet woman with kind eyes, began offering him coffee and sandwiches. And then, 3 days before Christmas, came the invitation that would alter Metzger's understanding of the world. It was late afternoon, the winter sun already setting behind the barn. Metzger and 3 other prisoners had finished the milking and were washing equipment in the cold pump water. Emil Hartmann approached, accompanied by the guard, a young corporal named Billy Jensen from Eau Claire. Hartmann spoke in English, which Jensen translated. The Hartmann family was observing Christmas Eve the following night. Would the prisoners like to come for dinner? Metzger looked at the other prisoners. One, a young Berliner named Klaus, laughed bitterly. "It's a trick," he said in German. "They want to humiliate us." Another, Fritz, a farmer from Saxony, said nothing but his eyes betrayed interest. The third, Eric, whispered, "Are we allowed?" Corporal Jensen shrugged. "It's Christmas. Colonel doesn't care, long as I'm there to keep order. It's up to you boys." Metzger felt a tightness in his chest. He thought of Christmas in Hamburg before the war, before everything. He thought of his mother's table, the candles, the singing. He thought of the last Christmas in France in 1943, huddled in a frozen trench eating black bread. He nodded. "Tell me accept." And thank him. That night, lying in his bunk, Metzger could not sleep. He wondered if accepting the invitation was a betrayal of his comrades still fighting. He wondered what the meal would be like. Most of all, he wondered why Emil Hartmann, whose son was perhaps at that very moment fighting against German soldiers, would invite the enemy into his home for Christmas, December 24th, 1944, arrived cold and clear. The prisoners were transported to the Hartmann farm in the late afternoon, still wearing their uniforms marked with the large PW stenciled on the backs. Martha Hartmann had spent 2 days preparing. She roasted a goose, boiled potatoes with butter, baked rolls, prepared red cabbage with apples, and made a traditional Bavarian apple strudel from her grandmother's recipe. The farmhouse smelled of cinnamon, roasting meat, and pine boughs. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, decorated with paper ornaments and candles. When the prisoners arrived, Martha ushered them inside, taking their coats, offering them seats by the stove to warm themselves. The prisoners stood awkwardly, unsure of protocol. Klaus, the young Berliner, whispered, "This is insane. We're eating with the enemy." Fritz, the Saxon farmer, stared at the Christmas tree with tears in his eyes. Eric said nothing, overwhelmed. Metzger felt as if he were in a dream, a fugue state where the categories of war and peace, enemy and friend, no longer applied. Emil Hartmann said grace in German, his pronunciation clumsy but sincere. Martha served the meal. Corporal Jensen sat at the table with his rifle leaned against the wall, eating with evident enjoyment. For a long moment there was only the sound of forks on plates, the crackle of the fire, the wind outside. Then Fritz began to cry. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down his weathered face. Martha reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Ease his gut," she said softly. "It is good." And the meal lasted 2 hours. After the initial shock, the prisoners began to relax. Emil asked about their families, their farms, their lives before the war. They spoke haltingly in a mixture of German and broken English, with Corporal Jensen occasionally translating. Klaus, who had been most resistant, admitted that his father had been a postal worker in Berlin and that he had not heard from his family in 8 months. Martha brought out photographs of her sons in uniform. One son, she explained, was fighting in Germany. She paused, looking at the prisoners. Maybe you know him? She asked, the question absurd and heartbreaking. Metzger wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words would not come. Instead, he helped clear the dishes, a small gesture of gratitude. For dessert, Martha served the apple strudel with whipped cream and coffee. The strudel was perfect, flaky and sweet, tasting of cinnamon and home. Metzger had not tasted anything so good in 5 years. As he ate, he realized that this meal, this simple act of hospitality, was shattering something inside him, some wall he had built to survive the war. He had been taught that Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. But here was a family sacrificing their own comfort to share a meal with enemy soldiers. He had been taught that democracy was a sham, that only the strong and unified could prevail. But here was a strength born not of coercion, but of choice, a unity rooted not in blood and soil, but in shared humanity. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Everything he had believed was wrong. After dinner, the family and prisoners gathered around the Christmas tree. Martha played the piano, an old upright, and they sang carols in German. Still not, Heilig Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. The words written 126 years earlier in Austria filled the farmhouse, bridging continents and ideologies. Corporal Jensen, raised Lutheran in a German immigrant community, sang along in German, his voice surprisingly good. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the world in white. For a few hours, the war ceased to exist. There was only warmth, music, and the fragile connection between human beings who, in another context, were supposed to kill each other. As the evening ended and the prisoners prepared to leave, Emil Hartmann shook each man's hand. To Metzger, he said in German, Krieg ist bse. Aber wir sind nicht bse. War is evil, but we are not evil. Metzger nodded, unable to speak. As they rode back to the camp in the truck, the four prisoners sat in silence. Klaus, who had called the invitation a trick, was sobbing quietly. Fritz stared at his hands. Eric whispered, I don't understand. I don't understand any of this. Metzger understood. He understood that he had been lied to. He understood that the America he had been taught to despise was more decent, more humane than the regime he had served. He understood that he had been on the wrong side. The Hartmann dinner was not an isolated incident. Across Wisconsin and the broader Midwest, similar scenes were unfolding throughout the winter of 1945. In Barron County, a prisoner named Wilhelm Schultz was invited to a Lutheran church service on Christmas Day by the family he worked for. In Waupaca County, a group of prisoners helped a farmer deliver Christmas presents to his children, dressed in civilian coats to avoid scaring the neighbors. In Marathon County, a prisoner named Joseph Bauer wrote in his diary that he had eaten Thanksgiving dinner with an American family that treated him better than his own officers ever had. These encounters were documented in camp records, newspaper articles, and the personal correspondence of the prisoners themselves. They were also documented in the reports of Swiss inspectors from the International Committee of the Red Cross, who visited American POW camps regularly to ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention. The Swiss inspectors noted with surprise the degree of interaction between prisoners and civilians and reported that German POWs in the United States were among the best treated prisoners in any theater of the war. This did not mean that conditions were perfect. There were incidents of abuse by guards, complaints about food quality in some camps, and occasional violence between prisoners, particularly between committed Nazis and those who had soured on the regime. But the overall standard was remarkably high, and the civilian hospitality was a phenomenon the inspectors had not observed in any other country. The symbolic object that recurred in nearly every prisoner account was food. Not the food itself, though that was significant, but the abundance of it, the casualness with which Americans treated it. Prisoners wrote of being given sandwiches with thick slabs of meat and cheese, of candy bars handed out by guards, of farm wives offering second and third helpings of dinner. They wrote of Thanksgiving feasts where they ate turkey with cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie, foods they had never tasted. They wrote of camp canteens stocked with Coca-Cola, cigarettes, chocolate, and canned goods. The contrast with Germany, where rations were shrinking daily, where civilians picked through rubble for scraps, was overwhelming. One prisoner, in a letter intercepted by censors, wrote to his wife, "You would not believe the food here. They feed us as if we were guests, not captives. They feed their dogs better than the party feeds our children. What kind of country can do this while fighting a war on 2 continents? We have been fighting the wrong enemy." This letter, and thousands like it, circulated through the intelligence services and contributed to a strategic shift in American psychological warfare. Leaflets dropped over Germany began to emphasize the treatment of Puss in America, encouraging surrender with the promise of safety and abundance. Some historians argue that the treatment of German prisoners in the United States contributed to the mass surrenders in the final months of the European War, as German soldiers calculated that captivity in America was preferable to death in a lost cause. Metzger continued to work at the Hartmann farm through the winter and into the spring of 1945. The relationship between the family and the prisoner deepened. Emil taught him to drive the tractor and to judge the quality of hay. Martha taught him English phrases, patiently correcting his pronunciation. They shared news of the war, the Germans retreating on all fronts, the noose tightening. Metzger felt no loyalty to the regime anymore, only a vague sadness for his country and the desperate hope that his family had survived. In March, a letter arrived from the Red Cross. His mother and sister were alive, living in a refugee camp in Bavaria. His father had died in an air raid in 1943. Metzger wept when he read the letter. The first tears he had shed in 2 years. Martha found him in the barn and held him while he cried. This enemy soldier, this man who had perhaps killed Americans, weeping on the shoulder of an American woman whose son was fighting his countrymen. In May, the war in Europe ended. The prisoners gathered around a radio in the camp to hear the announcement of German surrender. Some cheered, glad the killing was over. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the defeat. Metzger felt only relief. He was alive. His family was alive. The nightmare was over. But then came a new question. What happens to us now? The repatriation of German POWs began slowly. The U.S. Army, faced with the enormous logistical challenge of managing millions of prisoners in Europe and hundreds of thousands in America, decided to retain POWs in the United States until sufficient shipping was available and until conditions in Germany stabilized enough to receive them. Many German prisoners, particularly those who had experienced the hospitality of American families, did not want to return to the devastation of Germany. They wanted to stay, to immigrate, to make new lives in the country that had treated them with such unexpected decency. American immigration law, however, prohibited the admission of former enemy soldiers. Thousands of prisoners petitioned for exemptions, wrote letters to congressmen, sought sponsorships from the families they had worked for. The Hartmann family sponsored Metzger, writing letters to the State Department attesting to his character and requesting permission for him to remain in Wisconsin. The request was denied. Policy was policy. In September 1945, Metzger and thousands of other German POWs were loaded onto ships in New York Harbor and sent back to Germany. The departure was wrenching. Metzger had spent 15 months in Wisconsin, longer than he had spent in some tours of combat duty. He had formed friendships, learned English, glimpsed a different way of life. Emil and Martha Hartmann traveled to Camp McCoy to say goodbye. Emil gave Metzger a small Bible inscribed with the words, "To a good man in a bad war." Martha gave him a bundle of letters to deliver to her son, who was stationed in occupied Germany. Metzger promised he would try. As the train pulled away from Wisconsin, carrying him east toward the port and the ship and the ruins of Germany, Metzger stared out the window at the fields and forests and small towns. The country that had been his enemy and had become, in some strange way, his salvation. Metzger returned to Hamburg in October 1945. The city was unrecognizable. More than half the buildings were destroyed. Rubble filled the streets. Refugees crowded into cellars and makeshift shelters. Food was scarce, medicine scarcer. The occupying British authorities struggled to maintain order. Metzger found his mother and sister in a Red Cross camp outside the city. The reunion was joyful and heartbreaking. His mother, aged and frail, wept to see him alive. His sister, who had lost her husband in Russia, clung to him and would not let go. They asked about his captivity, expecting tales of suffering. Instead, he told them about Wisconsin, about the Hartmann farm, about Christmas dinner and apple strudel and kindness from the enemy. They did not believe him at first. It sounded like a fairy tale, a dream, but Metzger had proof. The Bible from Emil, a photograph of the Hartmann family, letters of reference from the camp commandant. Gradually, they accepted that his story was true, and the acceptance brought a kind of despair. If the Americans were this decent, this generous, this strong, then Germany had not just lost the war militarily. It had lost morally, ideologically, utterly. The belief system they had been raised in, the justifications they had clung to, collapsed. In the ruins of Hamburg, Hans Metzger began the long process of rebuilding. Not just his physical life, but his understanding of the world across Germany. Tens of thousands of returning prisoners carried similar stories. They spoke of abundance in America, of freedom, of respect for human dignity, even in captivity. They spoke of being fed better as prisoners than they had been as soldiers, of working for wages, of singing Christmas carols with the enemy. These stories spread through the occupation zones, creating a collective cognitive dissonance that rippled through German society. Some former prisoners, particularly committed Nazis, dismissed the accounts as lies or explained them away as American propaganda designed to weaken German resolve. But most, like Metzger, could not dismiss what they had experienced. The contrast between Nazi ideology and American reality was too stark. This created fertile ground for the re-education efforts of the Allied occupation. The Americans, British, and French sought to denazify Germany, to rebuild democratic institutions, to integrate Germany into the Western Alliance. The task was immense, but the returning prisoners, having glimpsed democracy and prosperity firsthand, became unwitting agents of this transformation. They told their families, their neighbors, their communities that another way was possible, that freedom and prosperity were not propaganda, but real conditions that could be achieved. In the long term, the treatment of German POWs in America contributed to the success of the Marshall Plan and the integration of West Germany into the democratic West. It was not the only factor, but it was a significant one, a quiet influence that worked at the level of individual hearts and minds. Hans Metzger never returned to Wisconsin. The immigration barriers remained in place for former enemy soldiers until the 1950s, and by then Metzger had rebuilt his life in Germany. He found work as a mechanic, married a war widow, and raised 2 children. He corresponded with the Hartmann family for decades, exchanging letters and photographs, maintaining a connection forged in that improbable Christmas dinner. In 1962, Emil and Martha Hartmann visited Germany and reunited with Metzger in Hamburg. The meeting was emotional, filled with laughter and tears, 2 families bound by a shared history of war and reconciliation. Martha brought apple strudel, baked in her Wisconsin kitchen and transported across the ocean, a small act of continuity and remembrance. When Martha died in 1971, Metzger traveled to Wisconsin for the funeral, one of the few times he ever left Germany after the war. He stood in the cemetery in central Wisconsin, surrounded by fields he had once worked as a prisoner, and wept for. The woman who had treated him with kindness when the world was burning. He returned to Germany and wrote a memoir, unpublished but preserved by his family, recounting his war experiences and his captivity. The memoir's final paragraph read, "I was taught to hate America. I was taught that democracy was weakness and freedom was chaos. But in a farmhouse in Wisconsin, on a cold Christmas Eve, I learned that the strength of a nation is measured not by its weapons, but by its generosity. I learned that freedom is not chaos, but the foundation of dignity. I learned that I had been wrong about everything, That meal, those people, that kindness saved my soul from the darkness of the ideology I served. I can never repay that debt. The phenomena of German being invited into American homes was replicated to varying degrees in other camps across the United States. In Texas, prisoners worked on cotton plantations and were invited to church barbecues. In Minnesota, they cut timber and attended Lutheran services with local congregations. In Nebraska, they harvested sugar beets and played soccer matches against local teams with townspeople cheering from the sidelines. In every case, the contact between prisoners and civilians created opportunities for humanization, for seeing the enemy as individuals rather than abstractions. This did not mean that all prisoners were reformed or that all Americans were welcoming. There were camps where treatment was harsh, where guards were brutal, where civilian hostility ran high. There were prisoners who remained committed Nazis, who refused to accept that they had been wrong, who returned to Germany and rebuilt extremist networks. But the overall pattern documented in archives and oral histories is one of surprising hospitality and profound impact. The German prisoners who experienced American generosity became, in many cases, lifelong advocates for democracy, reconciliation, and transatlantic friendship. Their testimony, shared across generations, became part of the collective memory of the war and its aftermath. The symbolism of the Christmas dinner, repeated in countless variations across the American Midwest, became a powerful narrative in the post-war period. It represented the idea that even in war, humanity need not be entirely extinguished, that even enemies can recognize their common bonds. It also represented something distinctively American, an expression of values rooted in religious tradition, democratic ideals, and frontier pragmatism. The farm families who invited German prisoners to dinner did not see themselves as making grand political statements. They were acting on immediate human impulses, loneliness, compassion, curiosity, and the practical need for labor and companionship. But their actions had political consequences. They demonstrated to German soldiers that democracy was not weakness, that freedom did not preclude order, that prosperity could be shared rather than hoarded. These lessons, learned at kitchen tables, in Wisconsin and Nebraska and Texas, undermined Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda campaign. They showed that the American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, was capable of producing a society of abundance, decency, and surprising generosity. This was the arsenal of democracy, not just in material terms, but in moral and ideological terms, a demonstration that the democratic way of life was superior not just militarily, but humanly. The epilogue of this story extends into the present. The children and grandchildren of the German POWs who experienced American hospitality have maintained connections with the families who welcomed them. Reunions are held, friendships sustained across generations. Museums and historical societies in Wisconsin and other states have documented these encounters, collecting oral histories, letters, and photographs. The story of German POWs in America has become part of the broader narrative of World War II, a counterpoint to the brutality and trauma of the conflict, a reminder that even in the darkest times, individuals can choose compassion over cruelty. It is also a reminder of the power of abundance. The United States in 1944 was able to extend hospitality to enemy soldiers precisely because its productive capacity was so vast, its resources so ample that it could feed, house, and employ hundreds of thousands of captives without significantly straining the domestic population. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of a political and economic system that, despite profound inequalities and injustices, generated unprecedented prosperity. The German prisoners who tasted that abundance, who saw it in action, returned to Europe as witnesses to a different possibility, a living argument for the democratic capitalist model that would prevail in the Cold War. On a snow-covered farm in central Wisconsin, the descendants of Emil and Martha Hartmann still work the land. The dairy operation has modernized. the barns rebuilt, the equipment updated. But the farmhouse remains still heated by a wood stove, still filled with the smell of baking bread. On the mantelpiece is a photograph, faded but preserved, of Christmas Eve 1944. It shows Emil and Martha seated at the table, flanked by 4 men in prisoner uniforms. One of them, Hans Metzger, is smiling, a tentative, uncertain smile, the smile of a man confronting a truth that overturns everything he thought he knew. Behind them, the Christmas tree glows with candles, a symbol of light and darkness, hope and despair, humanity and war. That photograph, and the story it represents, endures as a testament to the idea that freedom, properly understood, is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of dignity. It is the freedom to extend kindness to those who do not expect it, to see humanity in the enemy, to build bridges across the chasms that ideology creates. The German prisoners who sat at American tables on Christmas Eve, 1944, learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible. They tasted it in apple strudel, heard it in Christmas carols, felt it in the handshake of a man whose son was fighting their comrades. They carried that lesson home to the ruins of Germany and helped build a new world from the ashes. The meal was simple. The impact was profound. The truth it revealed about freedom, abundance, and the democratic spirit was a truth that reshaped a generation and echoes still across the decades.